Happy Easter 2025. This year I decided I would have a kind of intellectual Easter. Um, I'm going to link to some other kinds of Easter videos in the notes, the show notes. Some of those are more inspirational. Last year I did a short series of Easter readings about the importance of the bodily resurrection of Jesus. I think you might appreciate that if you want something a little more inspiring in that sense on Easter. I will single out one in particular from a different year, several years ago, about Jesus sending a message, I told you so, to the women through the angel. I thought that one went particularly well. And I'll probably, pull that out and put a link to that in the show notes as well. But this year, I'm going to talk about a couple of alleged discrepancies in the Easter narratives that I have never, as far as I can recall, weighed in on before in my books or columns or whatever. And, I tried to hit all of those, at least all of the really common ones, in Testimonies to the Truth in the chapter on reconcilable variations. And so if you're interested, I would encourage you to read that chapter. But these are a couple that I don't think I got into in that chapter. My attention was drawn to them by Jonathan McLatchie's recent post in response to Dan McClellan. I agreed with Jonathan's assessment. Jonathan's also a good friend, but I just thought he did a good job. But I even have some more to add on a couple of these points. First, I'm going to hit an alleged discrepancy about the women bringing spices on Easter morning to Jesus. Mark says that they bought spices after the Sabbath was over. Now, Luke doesn't super explicitly say when they bought the spices, but the way he narrates, I think, is pretty naturally taken to mean that the women went home after Jesus' death and prepared the spices prior to sundown on the Friday, therefore prior to the actual official beginning of the Sabbath. They just saw the tomb where Joseph and of Arimathea and Nicodemus were going to lay Jesus, and then they went home, and it would have to be pretty quickly, prepared spices, and then rested on the Sabbath, and then on Easter Sunday morning early came with the spices that they'd already prepared. So this is an alleged discrepancy that Mark seems to be saying they didn't even buy the spices till the Sabbath had ended, and Luke seems to be saying that they prepared the spices even before the Sabbath began. Now, Jonathan suggests two possible solutions to this, both very sensible, and in this respect, he's similar to John Wenham's Easter Enigma, which is a book I often refer to in these contexts. Wenham suggests the same two possible answers. I lean more toward one of them than the other. One of them is a possibility of a chronological narration on Luke's part, that even though Luke says they prepared spices and then says they rested on the Sabbath according to the law, he isn't necessarily saying that they prepared the spices before they rested on the Sabbath. They might have gotten and prepared them after the Sabbath. But what I think is a stronger suggestion, and even more in line again with just common sense considerations, is that the women didn't all prepare their spices at the same time. I think these women didn't all come from the same socioeconomic background. Joanna, for example, whom Luke explicitly mentions, and he's the only one who mentions her, and that she was one of the women who came to the tomb. was the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, so she would have had a higher economic station. Mary Magdalene, we don't know a whole lot about her, but it says, that Jesus had cast 7 demons out of her. We don't have any male mentioned with who supported her or anything like that, unlike Chuza. And I think it's useful to remember in a lot of alleged discrepancies concerning the Easter narratives, the size of the group of women. There's no contradiction, or I would say even any apparent contradiction, among the gospel authors about this size, but they do mention different women. And we get the largest group mention in Luke. He says Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, Joanna, and other women with them. So that's at least 5 and could be even more. Whereas Mark mentions, if I recall correctly, the 2 Marys and Salome coming to the tomb, and Matthew mentions just Mary Magdalene and what he calls the other Mary coming to the tomb. So, these are all compatible, but Luke's is the largest group. So Wenham suggests, and I think this is plausible, that they weren't all staying in the same place, that when they dispersed after seeing the tomb where Jesus was buried and went to wherever they were all staying for the Sabbath, they went to different places. As Wenham mentions, well-off women, Jewish women, were allowed and even encouraged to have perfumes and spices and things that they owned for themselves. And so it's possible that Joanna and maybe one other person who was staying with her were able to prepare spices from a stock that Joanna already had at home because she was from a higher economic sector. But that some of the other women, instead, they wanted to bring, something of their own. And that they went out as soon as the shops were open, again after the end of the Sabbath, which could have been after sundown on Saturday evening, and bought other spices for themselves. And, I often liken this to bringing flowers to a grave in our own culture. And if your friend brings a really nice wreath, that doesn't stop you from wanting to bring, your 2 carnations or whatever, because you loved the person too. It's an offering, a symbolic offering from yourself to the memory of that person. This, of course, is also relevant to the really silly objection that Jesus was anointed prior to his burial, according to John, by Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, and that the women came to anoint him after his body after the end of the Sabbath, according to the synoptics. Like, this is a contradiction. No, the fact that the men put really expensive stuff, it's a lot of ointment and stuff that John mentions, wouldn't preclude the women wanting to bring their own. So by the same token, if some of them already had spices, that wouldn't preclude others among the group wanting to obtain and bring their own spices, which they then could only do after the end of the Sabbath. So I think that's the best answer there. And again, it just accesses so many common sense things, not even in itself anything that's, miraculous or unusual. Now, I want to move on to the alleged discrepancy that Mark and Luke say that the women didn't see the angel or angels. Luke mentions 2, Mark only mentions 1, until they entered the tomb. And I think that's very clear in Mark and Luke. But, says the objection, Matthew supposedly portrays them seeing the angel roll the stone away and then hear his message when he's outside the tomb. Now, that's a first impression you could get from Matthew. And actually, I'm going to grab a Bible and just read the passage here from Matthew. So here's Matthew 28. Now, this is in the NASB, by the way, version. Now, after the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the grave. And behold, a severe earthquake had occurred, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled away the stone and sat upon it. And his appearance was like lightning, and his garment as white as snow. And the guards shook for fear of him and became like dead men. And the angel answered and said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who has been crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, just as he said. Come see the place where he was lying." Okay, now I agree that at a first impression, if that's all you had, you might think that all of that was taking place outside the sepulcher. But it's really important to realize that there's nothing inherently religious, as I'm often saying, about correcting a first impression when you have more than one account of the same event. We do this all the time if we're reasonable people. So the question is this first impression from Matthew so strongly supported that it's just ridiculous and strained to suggest that, in fact, the women first saw the angel inside, and that's not a contradiction with Matthew. All right, well, one thing that's been brought up here that Jonathan just answers quite rightly, and I think we can dismiss, is that this isn't translated in the, it is translated in the NASB, and behold, in verse 2, and then refers to the earthquake and the angel descending, Kai Idu. And McLellan had said that should be translated as "and suddenly," and that it should mean that the earthquake and the angel and so forth all happened after the women had arrived at the tomb, which has been narrated in the first verse there. But literally it does mean "and behold." It's just an exclamation, an interjection, if you will, in the mouth of the narrator. So it draws attention to what he's about to say. And, we might say, wow, and lo, as it's sometimes translated in slightly more archaic language versions. And here, quite literally, "and behold." So Matthew's just drawing our attention to this striking thing he's about to narrate. It's just kind of a surprising overinterpretation to take that to mean that this didn't happen until after the women arrived. Matthew's speaking to his readers, and behold, whoa, looky here, whoa, and so forth. There was an earthquake and an angel descended from heaven. All right, so that one I think is just frivolous. But a few other points I have to add. So you'll notice that the NASB translates "a severe earthquake had occurred," which in English we call the pluperfect. Strictly speaking, the literal tense there in the Greek is the aorist, which is just a simple past. An angel, an earthquake occurred, an angel descended, and so forth. Just a simple past tense. So then again, the claim is that, an earthquake had occurred, the angel had descended, is placing the time of that, like in a flashback prior to the coming of the women. So is that some kind of a strained attempt to harmonize? Well, Wenham points out that even though Greek had a more official pluperfect, they didn't seem to use it very much. And they did, at times, use the aorist, that simple past, for what the context indicates should be translated using the English pluperfect. This had occurred. In other words, in this case, could be that the earthquake and the angel's descent and so forth is occurring just a little bit before what Matthew has just narrated of the women arriving, and that's an open interpretation. It's not necessitated by the Greek, but it's definitely possible. Now, I want to point out that this isn't just a bare possibility. We actually have an example right in Matthew 14:3, where Matthew uses the aorist in exactly this sense, that Herod had cast John the Baptist into prison, and Matthew is doing that as a flashback. He means that as a flashback. He starts off by narrating that, Herod's speculating about who Jesus is, but then he flashes back to talk about something that occurred prior to this part of the narrative, the earlier story of how Herod had imprisoned John the Baptist and eventually killed him. So again, this isn't merely theoretical. This is something that Matthew does elsewhere, using the aorist in a place where he clearly means it in a pluperfect sense. So that's a realistic possibility here as well. Now, another argument that came up in the subsequent discussion of Jonathan's post on Facebook, as it is translated here, the angel answered and said to the women, "Do not be afraid." Okay, so here was the argument, kind of a strange argument. This word is often used in a very ordinary way in dialogue. He said this, he answered that, etc. Back and forth, just answered, to answer a question or to answer a different bit of dialogue. And the argument was apparently that this use of answered by Matthew, the narrator of Matthew, is meant to indicate that the women had seen everything that came before. But I want to ask why we should say that, or why we should think that. We can all see that there hasn't been any previous verbal dialogue in Matthew. Even though it says answered and said, he's not answering anything that the woman says. So this is apokrythes, and even someone making this argument has to concede that this is a place where it's being used, but not to answer some dialogue or some saying from the women outside the tomb. It has to be a response to their fear, which the objector is saying is their fear because they saw the whole thing. And that's exactly what's in question. Does their fear, to which the angel is responding, have to be in turn a response to all of the narrated events, including the angel coming down and his face being like lightning and so forth? Why? Now, in passing, we even have a usage of answered and said in Matthew where there isn't even a situation that the person is responding to. Matthew 11:25, the beginning of the so-called Johannine thunderbolt, begins, "Jesus answered and said, 'I thank you, Father,'" etc. And it's just this sort of free-floating saying of Jesus. Like, we don't even know why the word answered is there at all. Now, somewhat more commonly, the word apokrythes is used in describing a response to a surrounding situation. There may not have been conversation, but it can be a response to an existing situation. So, Jesus answers and says in Luke, when he stops Peter, after Peter cuts off the servant's ear in the garden, you remember that, he answered and said, "Suffer it thus far," which is sometimes translated as stop, and then he heals his ear. So he's answering the fact that the servant's ear has been cut off. In Matthew 17:4, Peter answers and says that they should build 3 tabernacles. This is the transfiguration scene. He sees Jesus talking with Moses and Elijah. And so what he's answering is, this kind of amazing situation. Now, this in Matthew has to be the the angel answering some existing situation. And since he says, don't be afraid, we take it to be that the women were afraid. So then the question is, why should we further take that to be that they were afraid because of all this stuff that's come before, as opposed to just because they've seen an angel? In fact, and so why would it need to include their seeing his rolling away the stone? That, again, is an overinterpretation. Now, I have positive evidence for the point I'm making here. Very strong positive evidence from Mark and Luke. Mark and Luke, who explicitly narrate that the women didn't see the angel or angels until they entered the tomb. But even there is a situation, namely that the women are afraid or amazed, which would make the answered and said word very natural. Though Mark and Luke don't use that word, but they describe a situation, okay, to which the angel is referring, as it were, when he speaks to them. So Mark 16:5-6 says explicitly that they were amazed at seeing a young man inside the tomb. They certainly didn't expect to see any such thing. They come in and, it's pretty dark in there, and then they look and there's these guys standing there. Even if there was nothing uncanny about them, you would jump, you'd be startled. Although Luke says more than just that they were startled. We'll get to that in a moment. But then in Mark, the angel is reassuring them. He says, don't be amazed. So it's the very same word for what they were feeling. It says they were amazed. The young man said to them, don't be amazed. So, calm down, basically. Well, that's a perfect situation where answered and said would apply. He's speaking in response to their emotions, just as the angel is doing in Matthew. So if Mark had followed the statement that they were amazed by saying, and the angel answered and said, don't be amazed, we would rightly think nothing of it. We wouldn't say, why does it say answered and said? They were just amazed because they saw him standing there. They needed to be amazed because of something else. It's, something more than that before we would say answered and said. No, answered and said in Matthew is responding to the fact that they're afraid, okay? Just as said in Mark is responding to the fact that they're amazed. Now, Luke makes this even stronger. Luke 24:3-5 says that their clothes were gleaming. The young men's clothes were gleaming when they first see them in the tomb. And then he says they were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. And this is a pretty dramatic response. That's plenty for the angel to be responding to. Okay? And so Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all very consistent among themselves. Matthew just happens to use the term answered. He answered and said, do not be afraid. But since both Mark and Luke confirmed that they were afraid, even very afraid, Luke makes clear that that's where answered and said makes perfect sense. It's very frequent in the Bible that, when we say, when someone sees an angel, that person is afraid. Very often the first thing the angel says is, fear not, don't be afraid. There's something about them, okay? So the Matthew passage is completely consistent with their not seeing him until they are in the tomb, and answered and said doesn't change that at all. Okay, this is a more thinky presentation for Easter this year. As always, I want to connect the prose and the passion, because I always say that. Easter is important because of the historical fact that Jesus rose bodily, recognizably from the dead. Its emotional and religious importance is connected to these historical facts. These historical facts are the conditions that make it possible for it to be known by evidence. The fact that Jesus rose bodily meant that other people, both men and women, found the tomb empty and then literally were able to see him, touch him, and have conversations with him. They, in turn, told others about this so that that information eventually came down to us. And that, in turn, supports the existence of a good and loving God who wants mankind to have a relationship with himself and to enjoy him forever, in the words of the Westminster Catechism, in new bodies of our own. I want that final end for everybody who is watching this presentation or listening to this presentation. I pray and hope for that final end for all of you, and including those of you who are not yet believers. I hope that you will become Christians, and I hope that you will become Christians because you know that there are good reasons. To those who already know God the Father through his Son Jesus Christ, I wish you a joyful and evidential Easter 2025. Please come back next time. I'm Lydia McGrew.